Welcome to It's More Than Grit, the CSIS podcast about the crucial role entrepreneurs play in the global economy. I am Mariana Campero.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz. Join us as we hear stories of both triumphs and setbacks and how economic and policy environments across the globe shape their outcomes.
Let's dive in and learn why being a successful entrepreneur takes more than just grit.
For today's episode, we had the pleasure of speaking with Joanna Pena-Bigley, a pioneer in generative AI and one of the inventors of Amazon's Alexa, and the founder of her new company, Vibes AI.
We discussed her journey to being known as the mother of cognitive experience design, her outlooks for the future of AI, and advice she has for all aspiring Latina entrepreneurs.
This was one of our favorite episodes to date, and we really hope that you enjoy it. Johanna,
welcome to It's More Than Grit. It is a privilege for Andrew and for me to have you on this show.
It's a privilege being here. It's really an honor.
You have been described as the 21st century Renaissance woman because of your unique combination of design, data, media, computer science skills. In addition to all of that, which is already a lot, you have been able to combine them to be an innovator, to invent products and services that are actually part of our daily lives. I'm going to ask you to give us some examples, but what I read is you were in the beginning of video streaming, Amazon's Alexa, some of the first apps for Apple Watch, many others. So please tell us your story and what motivated a young girl from San Antonio, Texas, to first become a journalist and then transform into a designer, engineer, and an entrepreneur.
So yes, I've had an illustrious career, but it started from really humble beginnings. And those beginnings started in San Antonio, Texas. Look, I grew up in the 1980s. I was a Star Trek nerd. I'm dyslexic, so I had a lot of trouble reading and I did terribly in school. But I was really fortunate to have an ecosystem and parents who told me I could be anything and I could do anything as long as I worked hard. And so when you combine that with the superpower of being of dyslexia, one of the things that I always find in working with other dyslexics, and I even have found it in my own children, we tend to think visually. We think of futures, actually more naturally, I think, than most do. A part of reading, and I think this is an important context, is I became somebody who wanted to conquer that problem. The reality is you never really do conquer the problem, but I was always trying to find hacks on how to feel smarter, because a big part of not being able to read at the speed of everybody else is an immense sense of shame. And something when you're a little kid, you just want to fit in. And all my friends could read really quickly and I could not. And so I was constantly looking back on it. What I realized now was I was hacking text interfaces so that I could feel smart, that I could be smart. And so I always found new innovative ways to take in information. Journalism for me actually was one of those ways. But what I found in the pursuit of truth and in the pursuit of that early career was effectively an opportunity. And an opportunity to kind of envision a future where you ask a question to a fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem that I was solving in my early days as a journalist was how do we not just report the news in a fair and balanced way, but how do we get truth into people's hands in a way that they can leverage it? And so they don't have to wait for the 6 o'clock news. And so if you think a little bit about this is pre-24-hour news, because that didn't happen until the mid-90s. I would tell you that happened right about the O.J. Simpson trial. If we all had to go back and say, when was that moment where we had a tipping point in our media? And that tipping point in our media was when networks figured out that people would watch a compelling news story all day. And that was a lot cheaper than paid or scripted content. And so that became an explosion of all three networks jumping into that space. For me, it was also the early days of the internet. And the problem I was solving was for a local O&O. If you wanted to reach your constituency, you had to gain satellite time. My earliest job was in Waco, Texas. I worked also in San Antonio during my high school years at local stations there. But the reality is if you wanted that news to come outside of that localized bubble, you had to be able to get satellite time. Satellite time is incredibly expensive. It was complex. You had to negotiate with your assignments editors to get it on there. And the reality is that problem kind of surfaced at a time when the internet was starting. And I was always hacking interfaces, always looking to create something. And I was going to invent something that was a solve to that problem. And that's when I, became self-taught, started learning to code. If you remember the early days of the 90s, you had to know to code to do some of the digital editing. So that is where I fell into, or actually stumbled into, computer science. And for me, I never looked back. It was a career that opened up immense doors. And what I realized was the thing that I loved wasn't just the storytelling. That's one aspect of it. What I really loved was the invention. And it was something that I had been doing since I was a little girl. I would actually tape myself reading aloud and then read back, and doing things like homework. So I was always finding kind of interesting ways of hacking systems to make me just a little bit smarter. So if you fast forward into, the video age, it was essentially the same thing. How do I help other people feel information in the way that I do in a more immersive way? And so that was what led to some of my earliest experimentation in developing one of the first streaming video players within the category. And when I realized that's something I loved doing, I just continued doing it. And I got very, very lucky. Or in my early days, I would tell you financially, I was not savvy at this at all. I share that for your listeners. If you think that you're going to have the unique savvy, both to have the innovation and ability to create patentable technologies and the financial sense, you're very fortunate. I was not. And so you stumble your way into these things, you realize that you're an innovator and you just want to get paid for that innovation. And so, you look at I think I'm a little bit wiser today than I was at 18 and 19, which is where I saw that pivot in the career happen. And so for me, it was about never looking back and really pursuing intentional problem solving in a way that helped people. Because inevitably, the addiction I have to problem solving is actually the outcome of having someone feel better about their day, be able to do something they couldn't do before, or it took less time. And it's such a gift. And it's such a gift and a reward to feel that you can be in service to people that way.
You really took me back because my initial career was as a journalist also. And I remember the days of covering George W. Bush in Waco, Texas. I certainly remember my first job on the assignment desk was booking satellites. So I know exactly what you're talking about. So I know exactly what you're talking about, Joanna.
I would have been, Andrew, that pesky reporter going, hey, this Branch Davidian story, it's really important. We should be talking about this. They're a shoplifting rink. We should have a discussion about this story. And developing one of those first streaming players was actually about democratizing people's ability to tell those stories without having gatekeepers.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that brings me to the question I wanted to ask you. You've really, as Mariana said, had a journey into the world of tech and design. That's something that a lot of us dream about, but can't actually do. And, I think your designs have helped companies and brands such as Land Rover, Nokia, Sephora, NASA, Amex, Pepsi, among many others. What are some of your favorite creations and why?
So if I had to choose something, I think some of the biggest disruptions was some of the work that I did in my work with Alexa. It's hard to choose which thing taught me the most, but I would say I grew as a human being. I grew as a leader. I grew as an innovator during my years and tenure at Amazon. And understanding the connectivity between the human brain and AI. And bringing those two things together. So often we think of them as very separate entities, but I look at artificial intelligence as actually not a tool. It's actually a subspecies that we've created. And that subspecies effectively works the same way that we do. All of the innovation that has gone in it to date, around human machine cognition has been really a mirror of ourselves. So when people talk about the thing that I would love the most, I think it's so much of the journey moving from pure design to hands-on building a product that, whether you use her to turn on your lights or you use her to say goodbye to a loved one, which was, some of the use cases that have, maybe the unintentional use cases that came about during the pandemic. It was some of the most rewarding learning that I ever had, because you could see it instantly. You learned to innovate at a clip faster than any organization does on the planet when it comes to both hardware and software.
Johanna, let me take you back just a little bit so that
Sure.
we can piece together your story, right? Sort of, how did you end up working for Amazon? How did you end up in the team that was inventing Alexa? Who came up with that idea? How did it happen?
So if I take you back, I was at IBM and I had left on sabbatical. And one of the things that I had done is I had gone up with some friends to MIT to go solve some really hairy problems. A part of working early in artificial intelligence at IBM was actually having had the luxury of, having access to the world's problems. And so some of the world's problems were happening at NASA. And I had a really great group of friends, starting with David Newman and Guy Trotti, who had invited me up to start an incubator, an AI incubator, where we were focused on climate. And that climate incubator, just, when you get into a space like MIT, you're doing something with your friends. You're in a place of constantly learning and creating. My learning is building things. And so it was there that I was actually giving a talk about something I had learned about the Internet of Things and that I thought was a prospective solve. And lo and behold, there were some Amazonians in the audience. And that is how they got to know me. Speaking of ambiguity, I like to walk through doors that feel uncomfortable to me. And so at a time when they came to me with an opportunity to learn even more and go into the early days of really both understanding the technical infrastructure of hardware, which is the Internet of Things, and the importance of connectivity and latency, and then applying that to a software and large language models and large action models, which during my tenure at IBM, we'd only dreamed of. We had dreamed of it for business, but to have an Alexa speaker in my office and have on my desk was something that it was like magic, an opportunity to make it science reality, move from science fiction to science reality. Effectively, me doing this, having a conversation about something that I was learning and being humble enough, and I think this is an important part in innovation, it's being humble enough to know that my answer may not be the right answer, but I'm going to put out a couple different answers as a hypothesis and let's figure it out and how we get there. And so that was really what the invitation. And once you're inside of Amazon, I was a kid in a candy store, just a kid in a candy store. And when you get that sense of joy and you're waking up every morning and you're learning things, by the way, it was really uncomfortable because these are all spaces that we were all learning with Alexa. Let's be very clear. If we take that same metaphor, here we were birthing an intelligence that today is 10 years old. And birthing of that intelligence was also putting over 100 million devices into the world, all over the world. And so if you think about what we touched, the use cases became infinite. And her ability to grow with us and grow into different categories from what started in my kitchen as a speaker into the categories of taking her outside the home and on the go and in people's ears was something that I just loved doing. But in that, I was developing what I didn't realize was actually an area of specialty, which is in the area of voice and cognition. I had already had the label of the mother of cognitive experience design because I had done some of the earliest work in designing products with IBM Watson. The next kind of step in this was the consumerization of the Internet of Things and making these things smarter and bringing together the human relationship between humanity and a smart agent.
AI.
And AI. It was the hardest to say, I'm now in a space where I've learned what I think I need to learn. And now I'm going to expand that into the current world around really solving some really incredible human problems with AI in the area of brain health. And so
don't go there yet.
I won't go there yet.
About that.
That's just a teaser, Mariana.
Yeah.
But
Perfect.
If we think about that leap, there wasn't anything that I didn't do and learn. It was almost an iterative learning of myself. As I'm teaching Alexa to learn, I'm teaching myself incredibly new skills. And one of the beautiful things and humbling things about Amazon is that everybody's a doer, from Jeff Bezos to my son who works in the warehouse. There isn't anyone who isn't hands-on. And what I loved about that hands-on nature was that you had a sense of ownership and accountability to the innovations that we were creating. So one of the hardest things to do today is to wake up next to Alexa at my bedside and not be able to fix her or learn with her. That being said, I'm learning in a whole new dimension. But if I look back on the most rewarding and maybe some of the most impactful work is being one of Alexa's mothers. I think one of the things that I'm really keen on is that acknowledging that in a world where the boys get a lot of attention today in artificial intelligence, they get the lion's share of voice. There are many women in this field. Now, are there enough women in this field? No, there are not. And I wasn't by any sense of imagination the only woman working on Alexa. She had many moms. But one of the things that I felt so special was to be a leader within the organization and to lead many more mothers of her skills and bring more Latinas into this space and bring more women of color, women who looked like my grandmothers who wouldn't have otherwise had that opportunity.
It's a really fascinating story, both your story and the story of Alexa and some of the other things you've been involved in. You're one of the pioneers of AI. AI makes our lives easier. I talk to Alexa every day. I talked to Alexa this morning before I left to find out the weather in New Orleans so my son could get out on time. He's at Tulane. This is the stuff that helps our everyday lives. But I want to ask you about, maybe the darker side of AI. Mm-hmm. And, what are some of your concerns around AI?
Oh, I have lots. Let's start with just the conversation that we're having right now about AI. It's the wrong conversation. It's a very polarized and political conversation. It's either the best thing since sliced bread or it's the worst thing since nuclear war. And that conversation has had a chilling effect amongst people. It's actually developed a real fear amongst people. And there's a tremendous amount of BS and disinformation. And I think it's important. We're at this place, people equate it to like the start of the internet. And actually, I think it's more profound than that. I actually think it was the beginning of the personal computing revolution, the one that I got to grow up in. And so the conversations, let's start with, I think it's going to be here and it's going to have a net positive. But because we lack AI literacy, the thing that I fear is that with that lack of AI literacy, that we don't garner enough understanding of what we need right now to put in the guardrails for people to get engaged. Because when people fear things, they distance themselves from them. They ignore the problem. And we are ignoring many of the problems. I want you to think about it. It's at a time we're bringing about a revolutionary new species that needs guardrails around it. And I want you to think about guardrails and I equate this to children. As a mom of 4, I wouldn't entrust my children with just anyone. Why would I entrust a computer system that I had helped to birth with just anybody? What you teach it is what it learns. And by the way, now in a world where we have things like computer vision, what it views is what it learns.
Right.
And so it actually is a mirror of all of our imperfections. We as human beings are imperfect in so many ways. And so those imperfections and biases, as biased as we are, and we all have biases, there is no human on the planet that doesn't have a bias. And so the importance of instituting infinite diversity and infinite combinations around the table is important. The next part of it, and I think this is, a really important thing that probably keeps me up most at night, really particularly in the United States, is that we actually don't have laws in place to protect consumers when we need laws in place to protect consumers. What we have been doing and what you're seeing across the country right now is an absence of a countrywide point of view on data security and data privacy, which is what we need. We're seeing patchworks of states come about and start to put in little patchworks of ideas. And that is sincerely not going to actually help anybody in terms of being able to regulate what we need regulated. And what we need regulated, I think about it this way. We regulate the oil industry, we regulate the automotive industry, and those regulations didn't stop Elon Musk from pushing Tesla to develop the first electric car or Mary Barra to get to autonomy. Those regulations have not stopped anybody or slowed anybody down. And I think it's a misnomer. And I think there's a lot of leaders out there talking about it in a way that is actually self-important. And the thing that I worry about is that voices of the people that are actually working in it every single day tend to get silenced when they have a concern. So, what I'm hoping for is that we begin to have a little bit more literacy so that we can have a rational conversation around the data privacy laws that we actually deserve in this country. And so I think that's a really important one there, because think about it this way. And I think this is an important analogy. If I gave you maybe a more human one with the mom, but data has always been the new oil. It has always been. AI is merely a refinery. So if you want to regulate something, you regulate the data. You regulate what we can do with that data so that the output doesn't harm anyone, because we first have to do no harm. And then, we can begin to actually utilize it for that data and AI together for much better uses.
Joanna, I wonder, with all the complexity of this, do you think that our policymakers understand or have a beginning of the understanding of this as well enough to actually regulate it?
So I do. I'm not cynical, and I actually spend a lot of time in the state of New York and at the federal level with those legislators. We have to demand it as a people. And for the first time, I want you to think about it. The next president is actually going to be the person who brings about this regulation. The interesting part is I think you're beginning to see the public see that they are at risk. I believe that there are politicians on both sides of the aisle. We actually need, as a public, to demand that we shift the conversation from the polarizing conversation that we're having right now about it and actually get down to the heart of what the real issue is. And the real issue is around what data belongs to you. What is your right as a human being living in the United States? And then start to actually catch up to the rest of the world that has regulated data and is holding our tech companies accountable. This is why you want to regulate it, because it doesn't necessarily stop a bad thing from happening. But when something does, in a democracy or even a bureaucracy, you can hold somebody accountable for that bad thing that happens. And today, nobody's accountable.
Joanna, do you think the European Union has done a good job in regulating this? I mean, could that be sort of the example that the United States should be following or not?
So let me start with, I think they're leading the way. You will hear people argue that, that kind of regulation has led to a stifling of innovation. In reality, that is not true. There's actually a ton of amazing AI companies coming out of France and Germany.
And Mistral, right?
As a matter of fact, Mistral, but I'd also in Germany, and let's be very clear about this, in Germany has led the way in the Internet of Things and data for over 10 years. They are leaps and bounds in terms of where their society is, in terms of their protections, and how they use that data for good. They're making incredible progress in areas of autonomy, things like that. You want to go see amazing things happening, go take a look at what BMW is doing in the world of mobility and stuff like that. So they don't lack from innovation. We just don't hear about it. And we tend to be a little bit American-centric, and we are number one. Now, are we the birthplace of artificial intelligence? Why, of course we are. But that doesn't mean that it always needs to be the wild, wild west. And that is where we are today, is that the vast majority of consumers are with basic protections to protect their identity, to protect their bank accounts, to protect their children, and then actually protect them in a way that holds companies accountable and does so in a way that has a forcing function for leaders like me to make the right decisions on behalf of our consumers.
So you've been widely recognized as the mother of cognitive experience design, and we've talked about this a little bit, but can you explain what that actually means and what led you to focus on cognitive and generative AI?
Sure. So it was during my tenure at IBM. A lot of the work that I was doing there often was for multinational traditional companies that had not been born digital. And so bringing artificial intelligence into companies like John Deere or General Motors or Citibank, these are all examples of bringing the basics of artificial intelligence into their customer experiences and doing so in a way that was about ultimately creating an experience that would endear their customers to them for life, hopefully. So what is cognitive experience design? Cognitive experience design is actually the act of bringing human cognition into the user interface. So you're utilizing human characteristics and the way that the brain works to actually create a system that mirrors or works in conjunction with the way that the brain works. And so there's a lot of social psychology, but also the neuro aspects, neuroergonomics that work. And so much of that is bringing those practices together, the practical application of artificial intelligence into every aspect of our life.
Okay, now let me take you to what you're doing today, right? Because you have applied all of that cognitive artificial intelligence into the company that you just started. Can you please tell us a little bit about Vibes AI and what problem are you trying to solve?
The topics, as we just talked about, right, of voice, cognition, neuroergonomics, and cognitive wellness are more than just AI topics for me. They actually represent what I believe is the next market-making opportunity. So that's why I left Amazon to start a company that utilizes neural networks to transform voice intonations into biomarkers for cognitive health. So Vibes AI, problem that it's solving is that we live in a world where we track just about everything: our steps, our heart rate, our sleep patterns, blood, weight, oxygen, glucose, everything. But in all of that tracking, we're neglecting our most important organ in our body, the human brain. And it doesn't have to be that way. There are actually 12 factors in healthy cognition, 10 modifiable factors that can prevent cognitive decline and disease. And so in a world where we are living, my generation, and I feel fairly confident about this, is that health is the new wealth. And so in a world where I'm going to live to 125, I want that life to be well lived, to be one of dignity. And so in order to get there, we've got to pay attention to the very organ that defines who we are. I actually consider myself a biohacking rejuvenation Olympian. The minute I turned 50, listeners, I immediately, you start going, wait a minute, I'm at what we thought as a generation was the halfway point, and it isn't. Everybody out there, actually, 50 is actually what the old 70 used to be like. So I have always looked at it and said, how can I not just improve my intelligence, but the health of that intelligence? And how do I retain it? So I've always been a biohacker, as we talked about earlier, but now I'm really into the area, what I would call into the rejuvenation Olympics. And so a part of that as a Latina, I'm fighting off generational chronic diseases. Like my dad had diabetes-related dementia. My grandmother had Alzheimer's disease. And this has actually made me super vigilant about my brain's health. But when I actually went to a recent checkup, it took me 10 hours just to get an appointment with a neurologist, only to be treated with subjective paper cognitive assessments and evasive blood tests and even brain scans. And let me tell you, it was super expensive. Not in just the time that it took, right? Because then after all of that, it took 10 days to get the results, and I was out of pocket $10,000 just to find out my brain was good, I'm in good shape, and I got recommendations for audio therapies that can improve my focus and anxiety and memory. And so if I looked at that and went, that's a problem in a world where we are tracking everything, then I go looking for preventative neurofitness. And what I found was a bunch of one-size-fits-all categories of audio therapies and mental health apps that lacked any real feedback and any guidance. And so that experience made it clear to me that our cognitive health and tracking system is broken. And here's what I know for sure. It doesn't have to be. So at the heart of Vibes AI, and I happen to be wearing a prototype today, is a radically simple yet sophisticated form factor, which is a true wireless ear cuff that we've reimagined to make cognitive wellness effortless and affordable. and it does three things. The first thing it's tuning into my voice and my mind, translating my brain's most vital signals for hearing, memory, focus, language, learning, creativity, social engagement, and algorithmic fatigue into actionable biofeedback and scores. I get a daily brain readiness score. The second part that it does, Vibes AI, the true wireless air cup, is delivering restorative spatial audio. So today, I'm actually listening to you. It has all of the features of a hearing aid, and I'm able to utilize any one of my streaming services. But what it's also doing, it is opening up a new category of therapeutics with a cognitive companion that's whispering cognitive wellness into my ear that helps lower those anxieties and improving my cognitive fitness and memory. And the last thing that it does is that it's actually offering intelligent mobile connectivity. It is a phone. I am able to make crystal clear calls and get crystal clear communications enhanced in my real life. And the reason it can do that is because it is tapping into multiple languages. It acts like a UN translator.
Wow.
So think about it this way. It's like having a neurospecialist, a brain trainer, and a super intelligent DJ all in one magical native AI device. And that is why I decided to leave and create a company that was really going to create a movement where we don't have to worry about our brain health.
And do you compare it like, for example, I'm lucky enough to be one of your first customers, right? And so you track all my brain activity. Do you compare my results to sort of an ideal brain? How do you measure if my brain is in good health or bad health? And what are the recommendations? How do you do that?
Sure. So we do have benchmarks. Let me start there. So much of the work that this started as a research project. I was learning something. The first problem that we were solving was, could I take voice intonations, the idea that the jitter, the tone of voice, the pauses in your voice, really finding and identifying voice biomarkers for your cognitive health there. And then the next part of that was actually creating an engine that utilizes those neural networks that's making those connections between what is a standard benchmark of 95% of the global population's benchmark, right, and scores. And so we benchmark against what high-performing brains should be doing. And by the way, there's lots and lots of data on this, but so much of it was sitting there and so much of it hadn't been automated or really put through artificial intelligence. And so much of this in the area of benchmarking was actually not just doing our own studies, but taking the studies that came before us and building on top of those studies and continuously learning to actually develop what would be a standardized brain readiness scoring system that you would look like every day. So I look at it this way. I get up in the morning, I wear an Oura Ring. I want to know how well I've slept because my sleep actually has an impact on that brain readiness score. Some of the work that we are doing today is bringing all of those data points together to give you that score. And so there isn't just one thing, we're pulling from. We are pulling from things like EEG and then your voice intonation. EEG is a sensor that is measuring your brain waves, your alpha and your theta waves. And so when you bring those two data points together, what we're able to deliver is a significant amount of insight around the health of your brain. And our brains are always learning. And the beautiful thing about that is if the score is in a bad place today, with a little bit of work in cognitive fitness, whether it be through audio or visual, immersive visual, you can improve that over time. And that, in a way, I think it's really important, is that the thing that is so important in those 10, remember I talked about those 10 factors?
Modifiables, right?
Right? They're modifiable. And we're taking those 10 modifiable factors and helping you improve them over time. So that today, if you think about our cognitive health, because of the expense and the complexity of the system today, we think about our cognitive health 2 times, early childhood learning and when you're 65. Well, to create new behaviors at the age of 65 is really tough. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we were doing those things at 35? And by the way, the things that we do, the silly things that we're doing and ingesting and maybe not doing and sitting too long at 35 is actually, and I will put in why we took the form factor we did, all that hearing health and the importance of hearing health. And you heard Apple accentuate it just yesterday, right? Our device already does what Apple does. But the beauty of we go a step further And we're pushing towards understanding that when you have poor hearing health, 1 in 3 of us has a hearing problem, doesn't even know it. And so when you have that poor hearing health and it's untreated, you're 8 times more likely to have Alzheimer's and dementia earlier. And so really important, if you could take care of that thing at 35 and you knew that, wouldn't you? And every time we ask consumers this, they go, yeah, of course, but I didn't know. And so that's the work that we're doing.
This is what I was going to ask you too. Is it too late for someone who's in their 70s, early 80s to benefit from this technology?
No, it's not. The commitment we have is actually, I sit on the board of a wonderful organization called Caring Kind. They're formerly the Alzheimer's Association of New York. And so what our research in that organization has shown us is things like blue zones actually improve the cognitive health of people who are in cognitive decline. And there are some portions, not all portions, I think this is important, some things that are reversible, but you have to make the commitment and you have to have the caregiving around you to constantly be pushing you in that space, particularly in the areas of dementia, because a lot of the areas of dementia are actually solvable. But there's a commitment to getting into that. And I'll give you an example of this. Knowing that my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease and my father suffered from diabetes-related dementia, which, by the way, Mariana, is actually very prevalent in our community because we have such high rates of diabetes. And so the longer you are on dialysis, the more impact that you are in the blood oxygen circulation to the brain. And so, when I saw my father begin to lose his centers of speech, and this was really heartaching because he was a prosecutor and attorney and such a gifted linguist. I always find that I get my fight from him and the behaviors that I have, instilled. I go, the truth and the behaviors was, that prosecutor was always in pursuit of the truth. But his ability to speak later in his life was actually impacted. And so much of the early exploration in that work was because my dad was going through that during COVID. And I would call him and we would have a conversation and his centers of speech would be garbled. And so to be able to apply that, he had a technology like this. I look at it and think to myself, we could have improved that communication center because that is modifiable. But it's modifiable through sound therapies. And so we've been working with scientists today who have actually figured out that 40 hertz therapies, sound and light therapies, actually have a wonderful cognitive wellness impact on people with Alzheimer's. We've actually, if you go to our website, published this research out there and you can dive deeper into the power of 40 hertz. So when we had that, I said, well, here's the deal. The science is showing that if you actually listen to 40 hertz 60 minutes every week and you have some kind of cognitive decline, that whether it's age-related, mild cognitive decline, or you're into dementia, these actually help. And so in a place of prevention, I listen to 60 minutes every single week. When we have a Vibe Drop, our company, if you go to Apple Podcasts and you just search Vibes, we actually give away 5 minutes of free audio therapies to anybody who's there.
I got my free Vibes yesterday.
There you go. But if you subscribe, you can get the 60 minutes. And the 60 minutes is what the latest science is showing as a cognitive fitness activity. And so just as I work out in the morning and do yoga, because I don't want to fall on the New York City streets, I don't want my brain to fall behind either. And so it's these kinds of conjunctions. When I talk about, here I am biohacking those rejuvenation Olympians, I will tell you that after being at this now for a year, utilizing these audio and sound therapies for my cognitive health, I have seen an enormous transformation in my overall health.
Johanna, I know we're coming to the very, very end of this podcast, and I don't want to close it without asking you.
I don't want it to end because I've learned so much in this podcast. I mean, I'm like sitting here astonished and can't wait to go order my ear cuff.
Me too. I want to be one of your first customers.
Well, first, Andrew, listen, listeners should go sign up. The easiest way to experience what we're doing today, we're in beta. The ear cuff you see in my ear is a prototype. We're 2 years from being in market. Super exciting. And we're in the middle of our pre-seed raise. So for all of those investors that are out there that really want to see cognitive health democratized for everyone, everywhere, every single day, give me a ring. Mariana, you post my note, because that's the work that we're doing. Because I look at it and say, if I could have prevented my father's cognitive decline, he would have had a better quality of life towards the end of his life. And in the end, if you think about it, we as human beings, if we're going to live long, we want longevity, but with dignity. And that's what we're designing every single day.
Johanna, you are a Latina, and only 3% of Latinas are in the world of STEM. Only 6% of businesses in America are owned by Hispanics. What advice can you give a young Latina who wants to have a career in the tech world or who wants to be an entrepreneur? What is that recommendation that would be critical for them?
Ganas. Okay. Ganas.
Hunger.
It's one word.
You have to be hungry.
Desire. Yeah. You have to be hungry. You have to have a desire to do good. It has to come from a good place. The money will come. So will the intelligence to manage the money. Because I have had highs and lows in my career.
Joanna, not only do I want to come work for you, I want to invest with you.
That makes two of us.
Yeah, and we definitely want to talk more with you. So this has been really, I think Mariana will agree, one of the most fascinating podcasts we've ever done. Thank you so much for all this really great insight about what you're doing.
And congratulations. Honestly, you are certainly a role model for me and for all of the other Latinas that will be listening to this podcast.
Your words and that feeling, that vibe is very humbling. That vibe is very, very humbling. I'll leave you with this. The answer is we're going to do it and we're going to get there together. This won't be the last time we'll have this conversation. I think the important part is that in a world where AI is not a fad, it's actually an opportunity to learn. And so my extension to you and your audience is that let's learn together.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Thank you so much for joining us today.